The voice of the Valley. 24/7. AM 1480 WLEA.
Two guests today, Rob Astorino, the Republican candidate for governor in Segment 2. In Segment 1, a United Nations reporter with the latest on the situation in the Ukraine with the Malaysian airline that was shot down. Reporter Tom Osborne, formerly with ABC, now with UN Report. He's in Segment 1 here on Top Story.
It's time for Top Story on AM 1480 WLEA Hornell. Here's Ryan O'Neill.
Top story this week is the horrible attack of the plane in Ukraine. A situation that reminds our guest Tom Osborne of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when Russia, known as the leading country then of the Soviet Union, sent missiles to Cuba.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
That was President John Kennedy in October of 1962. On the line with us now, former ABC News correspondent, and he's currently with UN Report in New York City, Tom Osborne. Tom Osborne, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
Tom, does this situation take you back to 1962?
Brian, it certainly does. I was about 12 years old then, and one of those people who hid under the desk, but it certainly reminds me of the dangerous stakes that were at issue then when the Cubans actually had their finger on the trigger when Nikita Khrushchev thought that he had control of those missiles, and the United States might have gotten into a nuclear exchange over the entire situation. I would only add our listeners to pay attention to the chief weapons investigator of the United Nations, Charles Dulfer, who reminded us that there's going to be some serious arguments about whether the Russians were behaving responsibly with respect to their clients, particularly with the aspect of them having access to these types of weapons, which are outside the command and control of an organized state, in an airliner passing through airspace where they have no way of checking to see if this is a civilian aircraft, friend or foe. So this sets us in a very dangerous situation. At last, the Europeans are beginning to pay attention. Angela Merkel of Germany will be taking some responsibility to protect the world from this carelessness. But Putin has played a dangerous game, and he'll have to find a way out of this.
Here's another clip from President Kennedy in 1962. You hear him here really resisting going into war.
Our policy has been one of patience and restraint, as befits a peaceful and powerful nation which leads a worldwide alliance. We have been determined not to be diverted from our central concerns by mere irritants and fanatics.
Any similarities between today's situation for President Barack Obama?
Yes, there are, Brian. Of course, both military advisors on either side, the Khrushchev to Kennedy, were pushing for an invasion of Cuba at the time. President Obama has enacted tougher sanctions, not an invasion against the Russians. He did this yesterday for just these irresponsible uses of these dangerous military weapons falling into the hands that should not be out of control. And this exactly reminds us of the Cuban Missile Crisis at that time.
It's been confirmed that one American was on the plane. Does that make it an act of war if a U.S. citizen was on a plane overseas that was shot down?
It puts everybody on notice. There were several nations involved, including, of course, the Netherlands, one of our allies. And if you recall, President Kennedy made it clear that any attack on any of our allies would require a full retaliatory response. So we're on one side and the Russians are on the other. And as they said back then, we're waiting for somebody to blink.
Here's an excerpt of yesterday's presser with the president.
I spoke to President Putin yesterday in the wake of additional sanctions that we had imposed. He said he wasn't happy with them, and I told him that we have been very clear from the outset that we want Russia to take the path that would result in peace in Ukraine. But so far, at least, Russia has failed to take that path.
Tom Osborne, is President Obama correct in the way he's dealing with Vladimir Putin here?
Yes, I think so, Brian. He's taking one step at a time. And, of course, we've called now for an investigation the UN Security Council has in a presidential statement. And that investigation must go forward to once and for all identify who was responsible and who was irresponsible in placing these weapons in uncontrolled situations.
You talk about the National Security Council. Just before we went on the air with this interview, you'd put us on hold so you could speak with a source from the National Security Council. Is there anything you can say about that conversation?
I've been in consultation with a source in the Security Council. The Security Council this morning issued a statement by the President. It's not the same as a binding statement, but it basically is a way to ratchet up the pressure on Putin to come forth and to own this situation or prove that it is not him that is responsible.
Before we went on the air, you spoke of how those who want to go to war don't fully understand the capabilities of Putin's military right now.
Well, of course, if it were a failed state, for example, we would be able to intervene, but this is a member state of the United Nations, and so that makes it much more complicated, especially one with veto power. But this particular nation with veto power has been acting irresponsible with over thousands of nuclear missiles arrayed on both sides. And so the United Nations and the United States has to take a careful ratcheting up in the situation, but it will be steadfast and it will prove who is responsible in the end.
Tom Osborne, those critical of the president have been saying that he's too soft in his rhetoric.
I think he's got just about the right speed. He's put him on notice, and there will be further sanctions if necessary. And so I think he's left himself with lots of room at this point. And that's what every head of state must do, because we don't have much room to play in these days.
Tom Osborne, we're getting down to just a couple of minutes. Any final thoughts?
Well, I just hope that the United States is fine-tuned with the United Nations on this particular point, because this is a particular issue in which the world is waiting for a response. Not just the United States, but the rest of the world who has lost their own in this plane crash. This was a plane 30,000 feet above ground, which was shot down by a strategic missile. That must be sorted out.
U.S.-UN reports. Tom Osborne, thank you very much for joining us this weekend.
Thanks, Brian. My pleasure.
Republican Rob Astorino, the candidate for governor, coming up next. Back on Top Story, Brian O'Neill on the line now with Republican candidate for governor Rob Astorino. Rob Astorino, thanks for calling in.
Hey, no problem. Thank you for having me.
This week, the U.S. Attorney's Office issued subpoenas to Heather Green. She used to be the executive assistant to Governor Andrew Cuomo's Moreland Commission. Of course, the Moreland Commission was created by Governor Cuomo to investigate corruption on the part of state lawmakers. And then, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Cuomo shut it down before it was finished with its investigations. Now, most of what we've learned so far is from the New York Times. Here's Fred Dicker on Talk 1300 on that New York Times story.
Headline, U.S. issues subpoena in inquiry on Cuomo's closing of Moreland Commission. Federal prosecutors investigating Governor Cuomo's shutdown of an anti-corruption commission have subpoenaed the assistant to its former executive director to testify before a grand jury in Manhattan, suggesting the criminal inquiry has moved to a new stage. People briefed on the matter said Thursday. And this is in today's paper. I believe it's today's paper. Maybe it's yesterday's paper. Must be today's paper. Today's paper. Federal agents served a subpoena on the assistant, Heather Green, on Wednesday morning, appearing at her doorstep before 7 a.m.
And Dicker continues with the Times story about the subpoenas.
The subpoena, according to two people who have seen it or been briefed on its contents, asked for documents and correspondence, including any communications with Mr. Cuomo and his senior aides. It also directed Ms. Green to appear July 28 to testify before a grand jury in Manhattan.
That's Fred Dicker on Talk1300.com. Rob Astorino, why did the panel get shut down back in March, the Moreland Commission panel?
Well, I think that's what the governor is going to have to answer to the U.S. attorney, and that's certainly where this is leading to, and rightfully so. I mean, we have said, and I think it's bearing fruit, and it's certainly becoming more and more true. I know it to be true, and I think most people are starting to figure this out now. This is the most corrupt administration maybe in the history of our state, and it's the least transparent. We know that. We just learned, too, aside from this U.S. attorney investigation, that came out yesterday definitively that this governor had the unmitigated gall to spend almost $200 million on this Startup New York campaign that you see all the time. But worse than that, $40 million additional money to go on TV for his political campaigns is being diverted from Sandy relief money, hurricane relief money, as people throughout Long Island, parts of New York City, are still displaced and waiting for a home. He has taken that kind of money and using it for these thinly disguised political campaign commercials. So we have that. Of course, we have what's going on with the U.S. Attorney investigation. It's been evident for basically everybody that, they directly interfered in this investigation. They were steering investigations away, allegedly, from either the governor's staff or certainly going to Democratic Party operatives or to favorites of the governor and donors. And now that is what the U.S. Attorney is investigating. Was there direct interference? And if there was, you're talking serious crimes here. I mean, law enforcement calls this obstruction of justice and many other crimes, potentially.
We're talking with Republican candidate for Governor Rob Astorino. Rob, these subpoenas, do you think that any information will come out of this that could be a smoking gun that's on both on the left and the right? I mean, you have yourself and others on the right, and even on the left you have the Working Family Party's Democrat gubernatorial hopeful, Zephyr Teachout, suggesting that something here could lead to problems for Governor Cuomo. Do you think that there will be anything in here that's really big that comes out of these subpoenas?
I don't know. I mean, certainly we know that the governor felt that he could extort the legislature, and he basically said so in a Crane interview, that he could do any interfering he wants because he didn't consider interfering because it was his commission. Well, unfortunately, that's not true, because under the Public Authorities Act and through combining it with the Attorney General, the 25 members of the Moreland Commission, 10 of which were a district attorney, they had subpoena power. They had the power to demand documents and testimony, etc. So if the governor certainly interfered in this in any way, he needs to be held responsible. The question is, if this is a real investigation, will it come out before the election or after the election? Certainly there have been, unfortunately, other legislators who have been either indicted or charged with crimes at this point. And we do know that, for the most part, it's a democratic culture of corruption, but this state is a cesspool right now, and it needs to be drained and fixed because, as Zephyr Teachout says, and I don't agree with her on almost anything, but we agree on this. This governor is absolutely corrupt and needs to pay the price for this.
You issued a statement yesterday saying that Governor Cuomo has spent over $237 million on pro-business ads about New York State. Wondering, Rob Astorino, where did this number, $237 million, come from? Do you know who broke that story?
The Gannett News Service and others have been demanding to see the documents, and the governor's office refused to give them, and then finally yesterday they released it. It came through the Economic Development Corporation, which of course is an arm of the governor's office, and to spend that kind of money is just unbelievable, especially in a time like this. And, it's bad enough. I mean, spending $200 million for any advertising campaign is enormous. But to add another 40 or to take $40 million from hurricane relief funds for people who are without their homes 2 years after this hurricane is incredible. And, it is just speaks to this governor and what he stands for. And he stands for only one thing, himself. While people are hurting, he could care less.
This week, Governor Andrew Cuomo created a new political party line called the Women's Equality Party. And we find that once again on this issue, you're on the same page as Zephyr Teachout, your other opponent in the governor's race. She says the governor is trying to buy votes by creating this new political party, and Teachout maintains the Democrats are all ready for abortion. They don't need to create a new abortion party. Rob Astorino.
She's right. She's right. I mean, it's basically the same group of people. So now they have three lines to choose from as opposed to two. The Working Families Party, which, of course, is the Occupy Wall Street Acorn group out of Bill de Blasio's agenda in New York City, which the governor now has signed on to take that radical agenda statewide of higher taxes and more spending and less rights and bashing business and creating a wedge, and so people will leave this state in record numbers. Just exactly what Elmira and the Southern Tier needs, right? And now we have created what I think is an opportunity for people to let their voice be heard on a real important issue, and that's Common Core, which I completely disagree with. I've said as governor I would repeal Common Core and do what other states have started to do, and that is roll out of it, get out of it, and we would replace it with something called the Law Standards, which the Board of Regents were actually working on from 2008 to 10 to elevate the standards here in our state, more transparent. They held public hearings. They finished the English and language arts, and they were working on the math when, of course, race to the top money came and the federal government dangled millions in cash, with the caveat that you go into Common Core. And New York State, of course, jumped without even knowing what it was jumping into. And now we're left with these, quote, standards that many education experts say may even dumb us down. And so, for those who say, well, if you're not for Common Core, then you're not for standards, high standards, that's such nonsense. We don't want to have a debate, so we're going to throw that out. I'm a parent, first and foremost, and I have 3 kids, all of whom are in public schools. I'm a product of public schools. I was on a school board. My wife is a special ed teacher. I know what I'm talking about with Common Core. I've also done my homework and talked to hundreds of educators and teachers and parents of all political stripes. This is not a Republican or Democratic issue in regard to parents. They don't care if it's a liberal or conservative issue. They care about their kids, and they're passionate about this because they've seen Common Core in all its glory, and they don't like it. And they know it's not good for their kids necessarily, and so they want something better. And that's what we represent with this third-party line. And, any registered voter can sign. Any registered voter can get signatures from the neighbor. So if you want, go to robastorino.com and download one of these petitions and go get some signatures.
Yesterday afternoon, I was down on Canasteo Street in Hornell, and I passed a car that had Rob Astorino anti-Common Core bumper stickers on it. In fact, I've seen on Facebook a left-leaning friend of mine who's a teacher who's now flipped to supporting you. Are you seeing this throughout the state, Rob?
Yeah, we are actually. It's one of those issues that is politically it's very interesting because, again, it's sort of bringing left and right together for different reasons, perhaps, but bringing left and right together. And it's also just bringing average, ordinary citizens of New York who are parents, who are active in their child's life, who are saying, what is this? And the more they learn about it, the more they deal with it, the more they're opposed to it. And, so I heard the frustrations back in last fall as a parent when I was at my children's, my child's lacrosse game or basketball or my daughter's cheerleading. It's what everyone was talking about. And everywhere I go around the state, it's what parents are talking about. So it's a real opportunity, I think, for parents to make not just a protest vote, but a vote for me to get rid of Common Core.
Do you think that the governor has started up the Women's Equality Party? There's 2 possible reasons that come to mind, and maybe it's both. One is because of the anti-Common Core party that you started up, the repeal Common Core party that you started up, Rob Astorino. The other one is, could this be political payback, the Women's Equality Party, for the Working Families Party twisting Governor Andrew Cuomo's arm to do what they wanted him to do?
Oh, look, this is just a down payment on the radical Bill de Blasio agenda that he has promised to take statewide. Taxes going up is next. More regulations on businesses and farmers, next. Demagoguery, next. Chasing away more citizens out of New York State, next. SAFE Act 2.0, next. You go down the line, and this is just the beginning. Does anyone really think it's hard to get an abortion in New York State? I mean, really? In New York State, it's the abortion capital of the world. So this is just pandering, as even Zephyr Teachout said. This is just absolute pandering to women and others. And, Andrew Cuomo should be ashamed of himself. If he really wants to to help women, the first thing he should be doing is getting rid of Sheldon Silver, who used hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover up sex crimes in the assembly against women. That's what he should be talking about, and he's not.
Republican candidate for governor Rob Astorino down to just a couple of minutes now, and I know you've got to get going too. Any final thoughts before we go?
No, look, hey, this is a winnable race. I want people involved. Andrew Cuomo is going to win the air war with just spending like crazy on TV, but we're going to win the ground game. Average, ordinary New Yorkers, neighbors, they're going to get out, as we are right now around the state, knocking on doors, making phone calls, putting on the bumper stickers, the lawn signs. That's how we're going to win this race. I guarantee it. And, you know, if people want to help out, do one of those things. You can also kick in a few bucks. Go on to robastorino.com. Cuomo gets $25,000 and $50,000 plate dinners. We get $25 and $50 checks. I'm more proud of that.
Rob Astorino, thank you very much for coming on this weekend here on AM 1480 WLEA.
Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Rob. Also, our thanks to Tom Osborne in segment 1. I'm Brian O'Neill. Stay with us. InfoTrack is next.